Welcome back to the show. Today we are diving into the rapidly evolving situation in the Ukraine-Russia conflict, political shifts, battlefield realities, information warfare, and what it all means for the world. Joining us is Ivan Katchanovski, a leading expert in Ukrainian politics and post-Soviet conflicts. What if you turn hardship into grace, anger into serenity? Everything changes. Make your life a masterpiece. Ivan Katchanovski is a scholar and just recently published his new book, The Russia-Ukraine War and Its Origin, published by Paul Grimm Macmillan just about 2 months ago. And back to the show. Thank you so much, Dr. Katchanovski, to be back on the show and really to discuss recent developments of Ukraine-Russia war, which is really troubling, and hopefully it gets settled very soon. So just for our listeners new to your work, could you briefly introduce what you study and what brought you into researching Ukraine and Eastern Europe? So to give us context.
Yes, thank you for the invitation. I research politics in Ukraine and conflicts in Ukraine as a scholar for more than 25 years, since I defended my PhD dissertation at George Mason University in the United States on this very topic of conflicts and divisions in Ukraine. And I'm originally from Ukraine, from western part of Ukraine, and I became interested in study of politics and conflicts in Ukraine. And I researched this for a long time, and I publish now 6 books. I have another book which will be published next year, also about Ukraine. I have also published now 22 peer-reviewed journal articles and also 12 book chapters. These are academic publications, and most of my research is about Ukraine and conflicts in Ukraine. And I just recently published a book, open access book, about the Russia-Ukraine war and its origins, which is also called From the Maidan to the Ukraine War, which examines conflict in Ukraine and possibility of peaceful resolution of this conflict, and also origins of this war and outcome of this war, which has very significant consequences, not only to Ukraine, but also to many people in many other countries, including in the West.
It's also worth mentioning that you had the courage to actually refusing doing some edits in your previous book, which was supposed to be published, probably one of the most important academic publishers in the world. And you said you won't do any changes because you do not compromise your integrity, because you are basically interested in the truth, and therefore you made it accessible to everyone. Really, you published it basically for free, but now you reached the goal really to self-financing the book. So this, I think it's very important that people actually know that about you.
This was important also issue because this book, which is just published 1.5 months ago by major Western academic press, Paul Grimm Macmillan, after very positive peer reviews, which is standard in academic world, actually was supposed to be published initially by Routledge. And I had a signed contact with Routledge, and I submitted my manuscript to Routledge also after very positive peer reviews by scholars who specialize in this topic. And when I submitted my manuscript to Routledge, the editors of Routledge told me they could not publish unless I would revise it to include narratives, which would be, again, which are dominant narratives, and again, in the West, and often based on again, on clear kind of fake data, which basically I had a choice basically to include fake data. For instance, they requested that I include kind of this as a real information that Russia blew up Nord Stream. And they also said that there was no proxy war in Ukraine and so on. This is just unbelievable, like a case of political censorship. And so for this reason, I refused to publish this book by Routledge. And I had to find a new publisher. And after all the standard academic procedure, I was able to publish this Palgrave Macmillan, which is, I think, much more widely accessible as open access publication of a book. And this is again, this book is available now also as a printed edition, and it's free online for anybody to read, to download, and to share, and to access, and to translate, and to republish. And again, and I did this using support from university. I received open access publication grant from my university, and also I was able to fund the publication of this book as open access book from crowdfunding from GoFundMe campaign, which is now almost completed. There are just several hundred American dollars left, basically, to reach the goal, to pay this open access fee to the publisher to make this book open access. And this is again, this is basically was a choice, because if I were to publish this as a standard book, which is I had the option to publish this as a standard academic book, it would be very pricey. It would cost like something like 150 American dollars, so, and it would not be accessible in for people to read. So basically, it would be of only limited use, and only would be accessible from scholars and academics who have access to university libraries, and very few people to buy this book, because typical academic books just sell about a few hundred copies, and for this reason, publishers do not, again, have to charge such prices. But my book on this very important topic, which again, so I choose the option from the standard option from Palgrave Macmillan, which is also offered by many other publishers, to publish this book as open access, to make it accessible for people, for anybody who is interested, and can just go online and find a copy of this book for free. Electronic version is freely available, and as already there are close to 200,000 people unique views and downloads of this book from the publisher website and from again number of other websites. So this is just shows the importance of open access research. And I published similar book, open access, as a academic book, but open access book about the Maidan massacre. And this book was published 1 year ago. So this is now a second book, which is published specifically about the Russia-Ukraine war and its origins, going back also to Maidan and previous conflicts in Ukraine, which examine war in Ukraine comprehensively and based on academic research, which is, again, my main area of specialty of conflicts and politics in Ukraine.
So let's just dive into, given how fast things change, what do you see as the single most important development in the conflict right now?
I think the most important development is a new plan which was proposed by Donald Trump to end this war in Ukraine. An initial plan was made public by, I think, Ukrainian media and Ukrainian politicians, and I posted this online, and it became viral. I posted English language translation of entire plan from Ukrainian language, which was posted on social media by Ukrainian media and politicians. And again, this became viral and received a lot of coverage and by media and online. And this actually original plan, which contained 28 points, offered a way to resolve this conflict. And this was initial plan, which was discussed by Russian representatives and Trump administration representatives, including Steve Witkoff, who's special representative by Donald Trump. And they actually proposed this plan as a way to resolve this conflict. But this plan was already modified during negotiations between Ukraine and the United States in Geneva. And a lot of points from this plan were eliminated. crucial points or just put open and not resolved. And for this reason, I think this plan now became much less realistic to be implemented because of strong opposition in the West and also among Zelensky government to end this war and to accept basic reality, which is concession. Again, the Trump plan was basically concession to reality on the ground about the war in Ukraine, about future outcome of this war, which I also discuss in my book. But a lot of people in the West and in Ukraine who have benefited from this war politically, using Ukraine as a proxy to fight against Russia, to the last Ukrainian, and also financially, for instance, Zelensky administration recently was involved in large-scale corruption scandal, which led to charges against close associates of Zelensky by Anti-Corruption Bureau in Ukraine following investigation. And there are also reports by Ukrainian media and by heads of this agency that other people close to Zelensky and even voice of Zelensky himself could be involved in this scandal. And there's such information that his voice was on the tapes, which were recorded secretly by detectives of this agency, which is supported by the United States and Western countries, and which Zelensky tried to put under his control, but he was not able to do this. And so now there are reports that former Minister of Defense, who is current head of National Security and Defense Council, and who was participating in negotiations with the United States in Geneva, would be charged by the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine in this scandal, which involves more than $100 million of getting money from state companies and from including companies, again, including money which was supposed to go for defense of energy infrastructure against Russian attacks. And also, there are reports that second most powerful person in Ukraine, who actually has no elected position, but who heads office of president of Ukraine and very close to Zelensky, even personally close to Zelensky, according to various reports, because of their personal relationship. So actually, there are reports that there are already charges against him for involvement in this scandal, corruption scandal, with a lot of money taken from UK, again, from aid and from defense purposes, but also from national energy, nuclear energy company of Ukraine called Energoatom, state company. So this is, again, major developments, which I think often are not reported correctly or misreported by the media and by a lot of people who have no knowledge about Ukrainian politics or have very kind of just primitive knowledge, because they follow this narrative that Zelensky is a Churchill who is again leading Ukraine to victory or would defeat Russia and so on, which is again, and that he is heroic defender of Ukraine and so on, which is actually not a reality. Which again, because I study conflicts in Ukraine, I study politics in Ukraine, I use variety of sources which are in Ukrainian language, which is my native language, also in Russian, in English, in Polish languages, and verify such sources. So I know that actually this narrative, which was promoted by the West since Russian invasion of Ukraine 2022, is a fake narrative. It is not actually what's going on in Ukraine. The situation for Ukraine now military is much more difficult, and any new peace deal, which again, if the current peace deal would be rejected, it's already would be very difficult to have a new version of this peace plan implemented. After again, because Russia would never accept Ukraine as a member of NATO or foreign troops in Ukraine, specifically from NATO countries, and so for this reason, any future peace deal for Ukraine would be on much worse terms for Ukraine and Ukrainians compared to what was possible to achieve now. And this already happened with Istanbul peace deal, which was very close to being finalized in April of 2022, but was rejected by Zelensky, again, because of he was told to do this by Western governments, by British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and by Western other Western countries, including by Prime Minister by President of the United States, Joe Biden, at the time, when there was real possibility to end this war and avoid subsequent negative impact, including many, I think more than now, close to 200,000 Ukrainian forces members who are killed during this war, and almost 1 million Ukrainian forces members who are wounded during this war. So this is, again, just one way to understand this conflict, is to look into this conflict comprehensively and not to rely on these narratives which are promoted by the media and by people who have no, again, knowledge about this conflict, or very kind of primitive knowledge, and or just repeat often narratives promoted by the governments and the media. And so it's necessary to look into academic research, and this is why I published this research and made it accessible for anybody to read. And there are already already 200, almost 200,000 views and downloads of my new book, which was published just 1.5 months ago, about the Russia-Ukraine war and its origins.
Before we go into the details in terms of all the propaganda and all this complexity that really Ukrainians face, especially the public, the innocent people in the Ukraine who just suffer terribly now for almost 4 years. I mean, imagine 4 years of war. Terrible. So, where does the front line stand today, and how has shifted in recent months?
Yes, I also follow the military developments of Ukraine, and according to information from different sources, now Russia now increased their advance in Donbass area, so they were able basically to almost completely capture Pokrovsk, which is very strategically important city in Donbass, and also nearby city of Mednograd, now encircled by the Russian forces. So you have a large number of Ukrainian forces members who are entrapped and encircled in this city in Donbass. And Russian forces also very close to encirclement of some other important cities in Ukraine, in Donbass area, which include city of Siversk, also city of Konstantinivka in Donbass region or oblast, and also city of Kupiansk in Kharkiv region. And this puts Ukrainian position in a very tough situation, because Ukrainian forces are not able to defend in all these locations, so they often transfer forces from one location to another location, and then Russian forces are able to advance very rapidly. And when Ukrainian forces were transferred, for instance, to defend Pokrovsk area, Russian forces were able to advance in Vovchansk city, again and almost completely capture Vovchansk city in the north of Ukraine, close to, again, in the Kharkiv region. They also were able to make a very significant advance in the Zaporizhia region, in area of Gulyai Pole, which means also very important, because Russia officially claims that it wants to have control over the Zaporizhia region of Ukraine and Donbass region of Ukraine, which includes Donetsk region and Luhansk region, which is already completely under Russian control, with exception of just few kind of square kilometers of territory, or few square miles of territory of Luhansk region. So basically, Russia is able to advance and achieve their strategic goals of taking control over Donbass. But they are not able to capture entire Ukraine, and they are not able to even, I think, capture at the current rate Zaporizhia region, completely Zaporizhia region, and Kherson region, which is another region which is claimed by Russia, which was annexed by Russia fully. And in the latest plan, which was made public and proposed by Donald Trump after kind of discussions with Putin in Anchorage, and with members of his of Putin representatives in the U.S. This plan stated basically that Russia would accept frozen line of conflict in Zaporizhia and Kherson regions in return for Ukrainian forces withdrawal from part of Donetsk region, which is controlled by the Ukrainian forces, which means areas of Pokrovsk, um, and also two most significant cities which remain, which is Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, which have about 100,000 population each. So this is basically a choice for Ukraine because Russia would be able to capture this territory sooner or later. But there is also danger of collapse of Ukrainian front line, as already happened on some areas to kind of at the local level. As just recently there was a report of um, of such collapse at the local level in the area of the Zaporizhia region when Russian forces were able to advance very quickly and capture a lot of territory. So there is such danger for much wider area because Ukraine is not able to mobilize a sufficient number of forces. You have forced mobilization of people who are captured again on streets and by force and basically forced to go to military service and without sufficient military training, they then sent to frontline, which again with a very likely high possibility of being killed or wounded. So a lot of them desert from Ukrainian forces. You have number of desertions from Ukrainian forces this year alone is now officially would be close to 200,000. This is just official number. So 200,000 Ukrainian forces members deserted from their units and and this is again just this year. This is again based on reports because about 20,000 on average, or close to 20,000 of Ukrainian forces members desert each year each month now this year on average, and this is much bigger increase compared to previous years. So this is tendency which makes Ukraine very difficult situation militarily because of possibilities that if there will be no peace deal now, the choice will be not to win and defeat, not to win this war and defeat Russia. This is now, again, even recognized by many people, and even Donald Trump stated this openly to American media, to international media, and Trump representative who is commander of U.S. Army or head of American Army, who visited Ukraine and met with Zelensky and other representatives of Western countries in Ukraine and other locations. He also said that basically Ukraine Ukraine would not be able to defeat Russia, and Russia would be able again to continue to advance. And this possibility then becomes possibility that Ukraine would face complete defeat and complete capitulation if front would collapse because of this slow rate of attrition, which becomes again increasingly visible in Russia taking more Ukrainian territory and more Ukrainian casualties, and a much larger number of Ukrainians would desert forces, their own military forces, and not want to fight in this war, even when they captured by force.
What military capabilities or tactics have most influenced the recent changes?
I think most important change in recent months was very wide use of drones by which use optic connection. So you have a specific very kind of thin cable, optic cable, which is now used to kind of lead drones to areas which and not to subject them to suppression by electronic warfare. For instance, suppression, the radio signal became now, I think, almost impossible because connection is not via radio signal, but via or GPS signal or any other such signal, but it is done via optic connection via cable. Very thin cable, which is again now very widely used by Russian forces to target Ukrainian forces, and Russia was able to achieve advantage in this regard over Ukrainians. So they're able to deploy these drones with optic connection, fiber optic connection in areas of frontline to very big extent and increasing extent, and target Ukrainian forces and do this at much bigger distance. So now it became very difficult for Ukrainian forces members to go to frontline position, to rotate from frontline position because to move supplies to frontline because Russian drones constantly try to attack them, to spot them, and it will be and it is now become difficult to suppress them with electronic warfare equipment, which was used before against other types of drones. So now, I think this is again another case of Russian advantage. Another major impact of this war in recent months was Russian attacks against energy infrastructure, against electric power stations in Ukraine. And Russia was able to strike and damage or destroy, I think, basically all or almost all large and significant thermal power stations and also hydro power stations in Ukraine. And only nuclear power stations remain in Ukraine. And nuclear power stations are able to provide a lot of energy for Ukraine historically because they again, they are not, they were not impacted directly by Russian military strikes, by rockets and missiles and drones, which used by Russia. But Russia has a capacity to, again, to even to limit nuclear energy production of Ukraine if it would attack uh, electric infrastructure, which leads to these nuclear stations, like substations, electric substations, which again can make transfer of electricity from these stations very difficult or impossible. So they would need to be stopped, or their output would be reduced. And this has already happened to a lesser extent, also as a result of Russian attacks. And Russia also attacked gas infrastructure in Ukraine. It attacked gas storage in western Ukraine, and it also attacked natural gas production facilities in like Kharkiv and Poltava region, which are major areas of natural gas production and extraction in Ukraine. So now Ukraine faces a very difficult winter because if Russia would continue such strikes against energy infrastructure, so Ukrainians would face a possibility of no electricity or very limited electricity during winter, and this means also a possibility with no heating or limited heating uh, during cold winter, and also problems with water supply and other supplies. So this is again makes that if Russia would just continue such attacks, it can have very significant impact, and which is already evident in power outages in Ukraine. Different regions of Ukraine suffer from such power outages, but again, last resort in Ukraine to rely on is nuclear stations, which again Russia did not attack because this would be difficult, and to do this from military standpoint, because nuclear power stations, they are much more protected because they are nuclear power stations, so they're specifically protected against even a large plane. Again, striking such a power plant, a nuclear power plant for safety reasons, but also this would be politically also damaging for Russia because this would mean again possibility of radiation leak, which can have again another Chernobyl. So again, and this would affect also other areas of Russia. I don't think Russian forces would attack directly nuclear stations, but they can limit the supply of nuclear stations by attacking electric infrastructure, which leads to nuclear stations, and this can limit their output. And this is again a very tough situation for Ukraine for this reason because Russia has military advantage over this. And so again, and if Russia continue, the longer Russia would continue, the more damage on Ukraine they would inflict.
So let's go a little bit into the politics behind the war, really. Ukraine's internal situation. How does this look like? How is Ukraine in domestic politics, public opinion, morale, and or political competition affecting the war effort?
In the Ukrainian basically politics, there is a dictatorship of Zelensky and his regime. So he basically stays in power in Ukraine. Even so, elections which were supposed to be held, presidential elections, were cancelled basically by Zelensky himself because he introduced martial law under his parliament, which was controlled by him. And so this martial law prohibited elections, presidential elections in Ukraine during the martial law. And this means that Zelensky basically can stay in power indefinitely as long as the war would continue. And he uses the war to stay in power. And he tries to kind of consolidate his power as dictator in Ukraine, de facto dictator in Ukraine, because there are no real opposition in Ukraine anymore, with the exception of just how to say, not opposition, but rival faction of far right and specifically neo-Nazi-led Azov movement and battalions, which now became brigades and now became military corps. So they're able now to have much bigger influence. And so they are basically, they support Zelensky, and Zelensky supports them and placates them, even so they're openly neo-Nazi in terms of ideology and leadership, in terms of organizations which organize and led these units, even so military units, which are National Guard units, even so many members are not neo-Nazis, but they are led by neo-Nazis, open neo-Nazis, and who advance ideas, use Nazi symbols, like openly use Nazi symbols and on neo-Nazi symbols. So this is again they are the ones who are able to also receive a lot of media attention in Ukraine, and they have power to overthrow Zelensky if, for instance, he would sign a peace deal, which would require Ukraine to cede the territory of Donbass to Russia, and, for instance, recognize de facto territory of Kherson and Zaporizhia region as Russian, and also territory of Donbass as Russian. De facto, even de facto, so this can lead to Zelensky being overthrown or even assassinated by far-right activists if they would want to do this, because they have such power in Ukraine. And this is like real opposition. Basically, they're not a real opposition, but they have such possibility to veto any decision, basically, by Zelensky, as they did already after Zelensky was elected on peace platform to end the war in Donbass in 2019. But he had to cave to far-right activists, specifically from Azov, after they threatened him publicly if he would sign a peace deal with Russia or separatists in Donbass to end this war. So instead he changed his policy and tried to placate far-right and including open neo-Nazis in Ukraine. And this is a major kind of, but there's still a major kind of risk factor for him, because this is not a kind of alliance of based on kind of real alliance. This is basically opportunistic alliance, because Zelensky just wants to use this to stay in power, to placate far-right and opposition, and they use him to increase their own influence. And so in terms of media, again, there is a limited freedom of the media in Ukraine. You have propaganda, which is still controlled by Zelensky and his government, in which all news television channels report the same state propaganda. The one so-called television marathon, in which the only point of view is that, again, Ukraine is winning and so on. Again, that Zelensky is hero and so on. This is, again, a classic example of dictatorship, which controls media. But there was important kind of example of a possibility of a revolt even within the Zelensky faction after this scandal, corruption scandal, became public, when NABU, National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, on November 11, openly announced the investigations of close associates of Zelensky. And this led to many parliament members, even from Zelensky faction, to try to open kind of their finally to say that they want to again investigate this corruption scandal, and they demanded even many of them demanded even resignation of basically of head of presidential office Andriy Yermak, who was implicated in this scandal, from Zelensky. But Zelensky refused to do this, and he threatened in response he threatened head of his own faction, servant of people party faction, with state treason charges. So basically this is Ukrainian politics. So Zelensky now tries to, according to Ukrainian media reports, he tried to order his own prosecutor general office head and head of security service of Ukraine to investigate his own head of his own party faction in the parliament, which has majority so this party has majority in the parliament, and so he wanted to investigate him for state treason, because they demanded a resignation of his close associate Yermak and partner Yermak. So this is kind of state of Ukrainian politics. So nobody can and this led to kind of to the situation when deputies from the parliament stopped opposition to Zelensky because now they know that they can be also kind of charged with such crimes, persecuted for similar reasons, because Zelensky uses this kind of law enforcement just to stay in power and enrich himself and his close associates, which is again almost never reported by the media in the West. And also, I think he tried to do this, and there are different reports about this, if he would be successful to do this, because there are also reports that he wants to continue this effort. But I'm not sure if, again, if he would be able to go against National Anti-Corruption Bureau, because he also wanted to kind of to arrest them, and so he wanted to arrest head of National Anti-Corruption Bureau and head of Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor Office. They also charge them with state treason, basically working for Russian, which is standard kind of charge. So anybody who tries to challenge Zelensky is immediately accused of being a Russian agent or working for Russians and so on, or ties to Russia. And so he wanted even to charge them kind of for their investigation of corruption in his own inner circle, which would involve Zelensky himself. But it is difficult for him to do this because this agency, which has, again, which is not part, which is, I think, one agency and a related agency, anti-corruption prosecutor office, they are not controlled by Zelensky directly because they were created and supported by the Western governments, specifically United States government, and so they have protection from the West, or they have very close ties to the West, and they often act independently from Zelensky to some degree because they have support from the Western governments, from the European Union, from the United States, and from their embassies in Ukraine. So they are able, again, to do this investigation in the first place, because otherwise anybody who would have tried to do this would have been accused of being a Russian agent and already persecuted and or kind of had to flee Ukraine, as happened with many other politicians who tried to, or even academics or even journalists who tried to kind of to go against Zelensky and his policy, which I think has tremendously negative effect on Ukraine because of his ego and his focus on his likes and his publicity, public relation image. So he basically, Zelensky sold Ukraine and sacrificed Ukraine for his own kind of public relations purposes by being uploaded in again in all these Hollywood actors, Hollywood kind of being uploaded by Western parliaments and Western governments, and getting a positive coverage, rave coverage by the Western media. So this kind of for him this is most important because he's an actor, so his kind of performance, and he basically says anything kind of which would please this and still continues this image. But from reality, from real politics, actual situation is very significant, and many Ukrainians are not able to express their own opinion freely now because of this situation with this dictatorship of Zelensky and media control. And so for this reason, I don't regard public opinion polls as reliable because there is no way for people to express anything which would be critical of the government of Zelensky, and many people are afraid to say anything critical against government and policy, and especially about such sensitive topics about the war and Zelensky's policies. But there are already reports with some public opinion polls which are not made public showed that there was a big drop in popularity of Zelensky and that he now would not win elections if elections were even relatively free and fair. Which means even the public opinion polls which are conducted now, if they still inflate results in favor of Zelensky, because again, people are not free to express anything against dominant kind of policy and dominant narrative and dominant kind of propaganda, which is presented as the only and the only possible view in Ukraine by Zelensky and his government and his law enforcement agencies, with the exception of Anti-Corruption Bureau, which is again has support from the United States and Western countries and other Western countries, so it's able to go against Zelensky and his, but not directly against him, but against his close associates because of support from the West. So this is just, and as I mentioned, also far right, including neo-Nazis, can also challenge Zelensky if he would try to reach a peace agreement with Russia on terms which were suggested, for instance, by Donald Trump in the initial 28-point plan. But Zelensky again afraid of this, and he also afraid to lose power in Ukraine, because immediately if he would lose power in Ukraine, this would mean that he can be subject to persecution in Ukraine, or even he can be he would have to flee Ukraine because of what he did to Ukraine and Ukrainians, and also he has also possibilities that he would be even kind of his life can be in danger, for instance, from far right or from other people who would try to again go against him, because he would be immediately blamed for this defeat of Ukraine and for all the losses and so on, when the media would be open and the politics in Ukraine would come back, and there would be some opposition, real opposition, allowed to voice their kind of criticism of Zelensky and his policies, which were terrible policies with negative consequences to Ukraine and Ukrainians. And this is, I think, just unbelievable that this could have continued for such a long time. But I think sooner or later, this in Ukraine would become open, and Ukraine and Ukrainians would be able to express their opinion about Zelensky and what happened and about this war more freely. But now it's not the case, and this is now still very difficult to do this in Ukraine. Again, but this is never reported by the media, by the Western media, who just take everything we just said by Zelensky as a view of Ukraine or Ukrainians, which is not the case, because Zelensky is not Ukraine and not Ukrainians, and he's now government is basically, and he himself is a dictatorship according to political science definition, and so you have state propaganda in the media, dominant censorship, and so on. And for this reason, many Ukrainians do not know actual situation in Ukraine, and still, for instance, charges against Zelensky associates are still not reported widely.
What do people misunderstand about President Zelensky's political position today?
I think people in the West, still many people in the West, they have this primitive view, that Zelensky defends Ukraine, that he is hero, that he kind of sacrifices his own kind of future, and that his own efforts and his himself basically for Ukraine. He defends Ukraine and so on, but actually Zelensky is a typical politician who is an opportunistic politician and corrupt politician, which is many politicians in Ukraine. But he's a very good actor, so he able to kind of present this image on the videos and on his speeches, which again, in many cases he's not write himself. He just given text and he reads these speeches again as because this is his job, so he has a lot of experience do this. So a lot of people just take this as the real image of Zelensky, which he projects, which basically he plays a role of president and this heroic president, but in reality he's very different. And for instance, in reality, he speaks and his family speak in Russian language. Even so, Russian language now kind of is not possible to express in government, Ukrainian government, for instance, publicly. So all officials, including Zelensky, privately speak in Ukrainian, but they actually, like privately in their families or beyond kind of public locations, they speak in Russian as a language, and even the tapes which were recorded from close associates of Zelensky, they were speaking entirely in Russian language. And this is, again, not secret in Ukraine, but again, but this is just one example. So Zelensky is just again playing this kind of role of defending Ukraine and Ukrainian language and so on, but actually he acts in a very opposite way. So as I mentioned already, he's involved in this corruption scandal, and there are reports in this by Ukrainian media that tapes which were recorded in the office of his close associate called Timur Mindich actually contain conversations with Zelensky himself about corruption, and according to these conversations and reports by Ukrainian media about them, Zelensky with his associates would speak very kind of negative way, very kind of derogative way against ordinary Ukrainians, basically as ordinary Ukrainians are regarded by this elite, kind of who have now power in Ukraine as basically as kind of as just tools to achieve their goals. So they do not have kind of they don't care about them. They just want to use them for their goals, and this is why they use all these policies. But publicly, again, they speak well, and he speaks kind of as kind of as defender of Ukraine and Ukrainians, but ordinary Ukrainians. But actually, he just acts for his own self-interest and enrichment of himself, and for likes and for again this public relations image. And just another example that there was a photo leaked to Ukrainian in Ukrainian media and was published also by a deputy from Ukrainian parliament of a golden toilet in apartment of this close associate of Zelensky. And this is the same apartment, according to reports and according to his admission, Zelensky celebrated his birthday. And because this is like his very close associate, and who also owns a studio, Kvartal 95 studio, which was also led by Zelensky and also was owned by Zelensky. So this is even before the war in Ukraine. So this is kind of Zelensky basically is master manipulator, master kind of how to say master kind of actor who tries to present this image of himself, which is not the case. This is like totally fake image, and his speeches again. Not affect real situation, but he still tries to kind of present himself in a way which is not consistent with actually who is he is in reality, and this is I think would become even more kind of public knowledge if this scandal would become would continue if Nabu would place charges against his closest people to Zelensky, against Umerov, head of National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, and against Yermak, who is head of Office of President of Ukraine, and they are also reportedly already under an indictment but for a large-scale corruption scandal, included in the same case as this Timur Mindich, who another close associate of Zelensky.
Is there growing pressure inside Ukraine for negotiations, or is support for continued fighting holding?
Again, according to this media narratives, Ukrainians just want to fight Russia. They want to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian, and the media would cite all these activists, Ukrainian voices, who would say this publicly in the media. On the social media, they cite like Zelensky and his government officials. Ukraine would fight for their territories. They would never give up territories. They would never agree to any agreement which would be detrimental to Ukraine. They would not agree to blocking of NATO membership in any agreement for Ukraine. And this is like this is often presented as a view of Ukrainians, but actually this is not the case. So this is kind of image which according to my research is not supported by data. Even so, as I mentioned, public opinion polls are not reliable because people are not able to say even in publicly, like, and also even in public opinion polls, which is supposed to be anonymous but conducted now by telephone. So basically people are required to say their views about something on telephone to total strangers who would call them, and in Ukraine there were cases when people were arrested and charged with state prison because they talked to their friends, for instance, over telephone or even in private, because they said something in private over telephone, and this led to their charges. So a lot of people, again, just afraid to do this. So for this reason, you have also many people who, again, in pro-Russian regions of Ukraine, like Donbass and Crimea, which are annexed by Russia, and again, they are not participating in this public opinion polls, so they are excluded. But they are most pro-Russian regions of Ukraine, according to public opinion polls conducted before the Russian invasion, when people had more freedom to say this, and specifically conducted before 2014, start of the war in Donbass, including polls which I commissioned. This public opinion polls showed that people in Donbass and Crimea supported basically separatist options, either seceding from Ukraine or getting in case of Crimea, or joining Russia in case of Crimea, or seceding from Ukraine, or becoming independent, or joining Russia, or a significant degree of autonomy within federal Ukraine in case of Donbass. And this was very different from other regions of Ukraine when Russian separatists was much smaller. Even regions which are populated by Russian speakers, because language is not main kind of factor in Ukrainian politics. It actually there was again it was more linked to historical divisions, and Donbass and Crimea had different histories, and were historically pro-separatist regions in Ukraine. So this means again that a lot of people not able to express their opinions about peace and publicly. But when I talk to people in Ukraine, and when I see a lot of information, even people who were previously very supportive of Zelensky and his government, I see that they now increasingly try to express their support for peace deal, peaceful resolution of this war, because they now recognize that all this propaganda about Ukraine winning the war, defeating Russia, Ukraine coming back to these borders of 1991, and that Western countries would support Ukraine, that they are allies of Ukraine, and they would not allow Ukraine to be defeated, and they would provide Ukraine with all these wonder weapons which would defeat Russia. That this was basically false or propaganda and disinformation. And this is just one example of this. Recently, even former press secretary of Zelensky, William Mendel, who was his press secretary since his election in 2019, and I think until 2021. So she said also on Twitter, on X, that what I'm saying is that many Ukrainians were not able to publicly say they support peaceful resolution of this war because of fear of political persecution, and even but she said because she said this that she supports this peace agreement which was proposed by Donald Trump, and because alternative for Ukraine would be much worse if war would continue, which is now kind of recognized by many people in Ukraine and in the West, but still not kind of reported widely by the media. And so, but she was only able to say this because she is now in the United States. So this is like freedom of do this. It's not possible to do the same in Ukraine because immediately there will be consequences and for anybody who would try to say this publicly. This is why I think in Ukraine, kind of I regard this as what I regard this as silent majority of Ukrainians who support actually peaceful end of this war, peaceful resolution, but they are not able to do this because they are silenced. So this is silenced by the government, by law enforcement agencies, which act basically as secret police and persecute anybody who goes against government narrative. In this case, and even popular bloggers had to flee Ukraine. One went to Spain, for instance, and another had to recount after they called for peaceful end of this war in 1 year ago. So they had to suffer this. And now Zelensky changed his refusal to negotiate publicly with Russia, and he said that he would agree for negotiate with Russia, but so it's now kind of there's relatively more freedom to do this, but again, on conditions which are not realistic. So Zelensky still claims that he would basically dictate peace deal terms to Russia, and but this is not a real possibility because actually Russia is able to already took already close to 20% of Ukrainian territory, and even larger number of Ukrainian population, which had much bigger population than 20% of pre-war Ukrainian population, and this is also kind of Russia was able also to advance now. So this most likely outcome of this war would be partial defeat of Ukraine, and if Ukraine would continue this war with diminishing Western support, specifically United States support, this can lead even to kind of situation when Ukraine would face a real possibility of collapse and capitulation as alternative, because this is like reality, and now this needs to be recognized in Ukraine and in the West, but still, again, a lot of media and all the politicians and many Western politicians and Ukrainian politicians try to kind of just present fantasy situation or this kind of disinformation that everything is fine, that Ukraine is able to contain Russia, and that Russia is not winning the war, and so on. And even recently, Kaja Kallas, who is originally from Estonia, Estonian politician who became a main negotiator from the European Union. She said that Russia is not winning the war, that it's necessary just to force Russia to kind of agree to a peace deal on terms which would be dictated by European Union, which include limitations on Russian army, military, and so on. And so she calls for sanctions. And this is again standard narrative about sanctions, that sanctions would make Russia kind of change their view on this conflict, and Russia would basically accept defeat, and Russia would have to withdraw from Ukraine, from territories which are occupied by Russia, and Russia would agree to peace deal terms on Western terms, on Western countries' terms, or Ukrainian terms, which would mean reparations, for instance, to Ukraine, a smaller army, and so on, and would agree that Ukraine would become a NATO member, which is again totally unrealistic, and it was already shown that sanctions do not work. And I mentioned this in my media interviews even before the Russian invasion, that sanctions will not prevent this invasion. And I mentioned after invasion start that this is not going to be effective. Sanctions are not going to change Russian strategy, Russian view on this conflict. So this is already kind of should be clear that the new sanctions are not going to change the outcome of this war. Russia would not be stopped in terms of their goals in this war. Contrary to the claims by politicians and by the media, who try to kind of still present this fairy tale picture of Ukrainian war and situation in Ukraine, and they close their eyes on corruption, all this high-scale corruption. They close their eyes on undemocratic developments, on persecution, political persecution in Ukraine, which would not be acceptable in any Western countries, but they support Zelensky because he achieves their goal as a proxy, kind of because he allows to use Ukraine as a proxy to again try to weaken Russia, and and without actually direct involvement of Western countries in this war.
What's the point of weakening Russia from a Western point of view? What's really the point?
So I think world politics or world order is became dominated by the United States and the West after the end of the Cold War. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union and end of Warsaw Pact, which was led by the Soviet Union, after countries, former communist countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, became post-communist countries after the end of communist regimes in these countries, and after these countries joined NATO. So again, this became a different situation. So there was no longer a competition between Soviet Union and the United States-led blocs, military blocs and political blocs in the world, and the United States basically became a dominant power in the world, and it led Western countries like European Union and many other countries supporting, including Canada, supporting the United States and this unipolar system of international relations of world politics, in which the United States basically was able to invade Iraq, to to lead also a war in Kosovo, and dictate their own terms to Serbian government to accept de facto independence of Kosovo, again, which is against contrary to international law. The same, they invaded Iraq on the false pretense about weapons of mass destruction, and this kind of just shows that this was kind of a view that the United States would be able to continue this for a long time, and they wanted for this reason to defeat any potential rival who can challenge the United States power and dominance in the world. And so for this reason, they contain and try to eliminate even such countries which were contain anti-American governments like in Iraq under Saddam Hussein, under again false pretense that this was again government which had weapons of mass destruction. They also overthrew and helped to again even kill leader of Libya, Gaddafi, and the same there was also start of the war in Syria, in which Western countries supported basically Islamist opposition, including Al-Qaeda, open Al-Qaeda fighters who actually now defeated Assad government and took power in Syria. So again, this and they try to do this for other governments, and for this reason, they also I think supported violent overthrow of Ukrainian government in 2014, by means of false flag Maidan massacre of opposition and Maidan activists, specifically to overthrow government, because this government in Ukraine at the time, which was democratically elected, was regarded as a relative pro-Russian government, and this government refused to join NATO and tried to again have better relations with Russia. Even so, it was not kind of ally of Russia at the time, and also it wanted to join European Union, but there was refusal from the European Union to accept even potential European Union membership of Ukraine at the time, until the Russian invasion and until this war, which is done again for geopolitical reasons. So basically, what it means that that the Western countries, led by the United States, they try to challenge any geopolitical rival, and Russia became such a rival, major rival, after it was considered to be defeated, basically as a result of Cold War by the West. And Western governments treated Russia as defeated power, and they regarded this Russia basically that Russia would no longer be any challenge to the West. They had a strong influence over the Yeltsin government in 1990s, but after Putin came to power, so he slowly tried to change this his policy, and he kind of built Russia as a rival to the United States, and specifically in the area which was in countries which are neighboring countries to Russia, and also he sent troops to Syria and tried to challenge dominance of the United States by allying to kind of loosely allying with China, which is another emerging power, which is again an emerging challenge to the United States. So for this reason, the goal of United States policy is to weaken any kind of rival, and since Russia started to become such a rival, so it was regarded as a need to defeat or to weaken such a rival, and this is why this was geopolitical reason which justified United States government policy and Western government policy of overthrowing of Ukrainian government in 2014 by means of this illegal anti-constitutional overthrow of Yanukovych government using Maidan false flag Maidan massacre of the police and Maidan activists. And this was done within a moment of oligarchic parties of Ukraine and far-right parties and organizations in Ukraine. And I published a book about this massacre as well. And this has actually led them to conflict in Ukraine, which became a civil war in Donbass, and Russia annexed Crimea in response to this. And also there was that military intervention of Russia in Donbass in support of separatists in this region. And finally, this escalated to a war between Russia and the West and Ukraine after Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022. And so Western countries use this war, Russia, and they use Russian invasion to use Ukraine as a proxy to weaken and to kind of even try to defeat Russia, because this look like a real possibility by using Ukraine, which is a very big country which has significant military and received a lot of weapons from Western countries. So it was able to kind of to resist Russia for a long time and prolong this war in Ukraine, because otherwise, without Western support, Ukraine would not have been able to resist Russia for such a long time, and it would have been forced basically to accept any peace deal on terms which were dictated by Russia at the time or very soon afterwards. So this is why I think this is just basically geopolitics of trying to prevent any challenge on international area against dominance of the United States and Western countries in general from Russia now, and this is kind of main motivation of the West.
Before we dive more into these actors, because that's very pertinent to really understand the conflict, but now let's just go a little bit into Russia's internal situation. How stable is Vladimir Putin's political environment, especially after the recent election cycle?
I'm not like I don't specialize in Russian politics, but I can say that all these reports that Russia would collapse, is a really like breakup of Russia, that Putin would be defeated or overthrown, are not based on any reliable information. And according to public opinion polls which are published, and according to a variety of evidence, Putin is still a very popular politician in Russia, and so there is also no real opposition in Russia against Putin, because Russia is also not a democracy. It is, and Putin is not Democrat. So basically, all so-called opposition parties, like Communist Party, they are our Liberal Democratic Party, which was led by previously by Zhirinovsky. They are actually they are actually more hardline on in case of Ukrainian war compared to Putin, and but they are not directly. That's why they do not actually challenge Putin policy and an invasion of Ukraine. They are even more likely to support much more hardline policy, and they demand like more involvement of Russia. They demand again capture of more territory of Ukraine, even territories which again like Odessa region, Kharkiv region, and so on, and even again as far as going to again going to Kiev. But this is not like I don't see that Putin wanted to do this during this war. But this is he faces such demands from more radical kind of parties and organizations in Russia, and opposition which is presented in the West as kind of pro-Western opposition, and politicians who support this and activists who support this actually in Russia, they have very small support now. So they are not able to challenge Putin and his government and his kind of his system which he built. Again, using also support from law enforcement, kind of control over law enforcement, also using control over the media, which is not free in Russia, but basically supports Putin and his policies. So in this case, there is no such real possibility for Western oppositions to take power in Russia, and there is no evidence that there will be any kind of collapse of Russia or defeat of Putin, contrary to a lot of claims in the Western media, because and in Ukraine, because I hope this is kind of this will be a way for again for them to say that Russia would be defeated because of such change of in Russia, but actually any changes in Russia more likely to lead to even more hardline politicians coming to power in Russia. So this would mean even more kind of politicians who are nationalist politicians, like politicians represented from Liberal Democratic Party of Zhirinovsky or Silkov, who was a Russian nationalist who led a Russian and Ukrainian separatist unit, which was involved in the Donbass war at the start of this war, and also other kind of nationalist politicians who again support hardline positions, and Communist Party politicians, again, which also support such hardline position, because Communist Party in Russia became more kind of nationalistic oriented. They abandoned a lot of their communist ideas, but they now embrace like Stalin, and also they embrace Russian nationalists. So a lot of Russian communists also support much more hardline position, and Russian Communist Party also supports this. So in this case, so any case of real possibility of any power change in Russia, which is not, I don't see any kind of such evidence, but in any such case, there would be even much more kind of hardline position by Russia compared to what Putin does right now tries to achieve, and he tries now to basically to force Ukraine to accept a peace deal on terms which were negotiated, which he tried to negotiate with Trump, and for instance, no NATO membership of Ukraine, taking control over again a territory of Donbass, basically by withdrawal of Ukrainian forces from territory which is still controlled by Ukrainian forces, but which Russia tries to annexed and already annexed legally, but kind of according to Russian law, but which is not recognized internationally and not recognized in Ukraine. But also Russia wants to also again kind of take control of entire Donbass, and also take control at least parts of territory of Zaporizhia and Kherson region, which is occupied by Russia, and make, I think more importantly, make Ukraine as a neutral country with no possibility of NATO membership and no foreign troops from NATO countries in Ukraine. So this is why I think Putin kind of is has a lot of support in Russia for his war in Ukraine, and there's no possibility that he would be forced to kind of he would be overthrown in Russia, or that he would be replaced in Russia because of opposition within the Russia.
How have recent decisions by the US changed the dynamics of the conflict?
So you mean a Trump peace plan, which was suggested?
Exactly. So how has it changed the dynamics, overall?
I think in terms of war conflict, it's still going on. Like previously, there was no changes in like in fighting in this area. in Donbass area, on Zaporizhia, and Kherson and Kharkiv area. But I think this plan, for the first time since Istanbul peace talks in March of 2022, open real possibility for peaceful resolution of this war, peaceful end of this war, because it was kind of which contained concessions, some concessions from Russia, even so it was again negotiated between the United States and with the involvement of Russian officials and Putin in before. But I think this for the first time this was a real possibility to do this since 2022 March talks in Istanbul because of the role of the United States. So this was not plan suggested by Russia, but in this case it was suggested by Trump. So he said that this is his plan, and he proposed this plan to Ukraine for Zelensky to accept, and this is why it had such significant impact, because United States was a major military supporter of Ukraine under Biden administration, and still remains indirectly via European Union supplies to Ukraine, military supplies from the United States right now, and still the United States provide intelligence operation to Ukrainian forces, which is a crucial source of information, which enable Ukraine to target like Russian military targets, and also able to target Russian oil refineries, for instance, and other infrastructure, energy infrastructure, which was hit by Ukrainian forces. So the United States has a lot of leverage over Zelensky and his government and over Ukraine, specifically also because of, as I described in my books, Ukraine became a client state of the United States after the violent overthrow of Ukrainian government in 2014 by means of Maidan massacre, which was de facto supported by the West. So in this case, this plan put Zelensky in a position to basically in which he cannot refuse this plan directly, because it was suggested to him by Donald Trump. So Zelensky tried to instead try to change this plan into direction which make it again more closer to his own position, but which make it not realistic to be accepted by Russia. So in this case, there is a choice for Zelensky. Basically, he cannot refuse this proposal from Trump, but he tries to make it in a way that to change this plan in a way which would not be possible to end this conflict, because again he regards that the war gives him possibility to stay in power and to avoid any kind of criminal persecution, and avoid even kind of danger to his life, or even a possibility to stay in Ukraine, because this again he might have to flee Ukraine if the war would end because of what he done. So in this case, I think United States plays a very important role, but Trump, like in previous situations when he tried to end this war, he often would change his views on this war and on the possibility to change this conflict very often. So he can just renounce his previous suggestions, and he already kind of suggested that this plan, 28-point plan, which was proposed by him, actually can be changed, and so he did not again try to back this plan, and he opened this for changes, and this has also happened before. So in this case, I think Trump is reluctant to pressure Zelensky, to force Zelensky to accept this plan for political reasons, because Trump has such power to do this, and he, for instance, has power to do this either directly by threatening to cut military aid, military supplies to Ukraine via European Union countries, which continue now, and he can suggest that he would stop intelligence provision to Ukrainian forces, which is again would be major blow to Ukraine, and this would make very difficult for Ukraine to continue fighting Russia for a long time. And or he can use also this American backed and supported and also kind of proxy agency, National Anti-Corruption Bureau, which can open charges against Zelensky, or just make public tapes with Zelensky talking about again corruption, large-scale corruption, according to information from which was published by Ukrainian media. Or I'm talking about ordinary Ukrainians, so he can basically throw Zelensky and remove him from power, or force him to accept peace plan on largely on Russian terms, which would again reflect reality, more kind of, which more plausible than any other alternative, which was suggested by Zelensky and suggested by European Union, which is again not going to be acceptable for Russia and Russia, because Russia has a choice and advantage, media advantage, so Russia can still continue the war for a very long time and try to defeat Ukraine completely. And so for this reason, again, this was a very important development. But in addition to why Trump cannot just force Zelensky to do this, just straightforward way is because it's politically difficult for Trump because he has opposition from this policy from his own political party. There is a faction which, for instance, represented by Kellogg, General Kellogg, who was special representative of Donald Trump for Ukraine, and also represented by Mark Rubio, who kind of supporting more, and also very strongly represented by Senator from the U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham. Um, so this is again, they want to continue this war. They want to support this war in Ukraine and use Ukraine to kind of weaken or defeat Russia. Even so, even Mark Rubio accepted and admitted that this is a war, a proxy war in Ukraine, and Ukraine is used as a proxy against Russia by the West, specifically. Again, West, which is led by the United States, because the European Union also often kind of just follow U.S. policy in this regard, but still, you have many European countries which also oppose such peace deal, because for them this will be also admission of defeat. So there are a lot of interests, of political interest in the West, in the United States in particular, not to end this war, contrary to what is stated policy of Donald Trump, because otherwise. Again, this is already was very clear that any such peace deal, which could be signed realistically, would lead to the media like backlash and to political backlash against Donald Trump, which already happened after after his plan was announced. He immediately was accused by the media, Western media, that this was like capitulation of Ukraine. This is like was betrayal of Ukraine and so on. New Munich agreement and so on, which is totally kind of just kind of outlandish, because there is no capitulation of Ukraine, no kind of this is not a Nazi Germany kind of style war with Nazis again, and this is not a kind of no quest for dominance comparable to Nazi Germany. This is again, Russia is not. There is no evidence that Russia even wants to take entire Ukraine, specifically Western Ukraine, and even Kiev. So again, and not talking about other Western countries. So there is no such evidence that Russia plans to attack them. But I think in this case, media and a lot of politicians, including from his own Republican Party, would basically go against Trump, and this is already also became very evident with European Union politicians, which also started to oppose such plan, because it was also kind of, but they did this not publicly. They now recognize that publicly it's very difficult to challenge Trump, so they do this behind the scene, trying to again change the plan and to offer their own plan to end this war, which is again not which has no chances of being implemented. And this is done, I think, deliberately, because they realize that you can not able to defeat Russia, even contrary to all these claims that is done, that it still does. And so they realize that still the goal of the West is basically to kind of try to weaken Russia. And this is this is still continues, even so Donald Trump suggested otherwise, because I think he recognizes a lot of issues, real issues in this case, contrary to many other cases when, for instance, Donald Trump tries to again launch regime change in Venezuela, and again there was a bombardment of Iran and so on. So this is kind of situation when there is a real possibility of peace deal if Trump would do this. But I think he's also has political limitations on doing this, and this is why he did not, I think, succeeded in this regard yet. But this possibility is that this war would end sooner or later, but I think much more likely it would not be able to continue for a long time now. And so in any way it might end next year, well, I think there's a very strong possibility of such outcome, either by peace deal or even on what conditions where you can even defeat of Ukraine by Russian military, which is becomes a real possibility next year.
What is Europe's strategic posture right now? Unity fatigue or fragmentation? What is it?
I think real European Union wants to, and European countries like United Kingdom, France, and Germany, they want to continue this war because for them, again, this is proxy war, and they invested all their capital, all their like public policies were justified. All these political statements, even their popularity in their countries, were based to a large extent or to a significant extent on this image of them supporting like democratic Ukraine, supporting heroic Zelensky against illegal and unprovoked Russian invasion. And they wanted to defeat Russia. They wanted to support Ukraine, support Ukrainians. They said that they want to obey international law. They said that they also kind of would provide support to Ukraine, military, financial support, and so on, in order to achieve the goal and to avoid Russia from attacking their own countries. But this is again, this would mean for this reason any peace deal which would be signed to end this war would mean their own defeat, because it would show that their claims that Ukraine was winning the war, that it was possible to defeat Russia, um, or that Russia would attack Western countries. Otherwise, again, or, uh, or that it's possible that Zelensky was just heroic fighter for Ukrainian independence and sovereignty would be actually shown to be false. And this would basically mean collapse of their power because they would not be re-elected. They already have big public support according to public opinion polls. So they basically would be forced to lose their power, and their legacy would be painted as basically as a major failure, major folly to support this war with such kind of disastrous outcome, which would mean that if Russia would win the war, which is now most likely scenario of this conflict right now, that military limited defeat of Ukraine is most likely outcome of this war. So in such case, this would mean not only defeat of Ukraine, but also defeat of European Union and also defeat of the United States, because this is proxy war. So that's why they don't want to recognize this, and they want still to continue and double down with saying that new sanctions would finally end this war, and Russia would have to be defeated, and because of new sanctions or because of new weapons supplied to Ukraine. And so they basically want to continue this war, and this is quite a cynical policy because this means that they're just using Ukraine and Ukrainians as a tools to achieve their goals, political goals, and this means again with casualties kind of Ukrainians killed. For them, this is just a way to achieve their political goals. They are not kind of concerned about casualties. They have no condemnation from the West, and speaking from European countries about undemocratic developments in Ukraine, about corruptions. There was no basically any kind of criticism of Zelensky directly from Western leaders for the corruption scandal, for use of force to mobilize Ukrainians, for closure of for religious persecution, political persecution, for his dictatorship policies in Ukraine, for censorship, media censorship. So this is again they use Ukraine by using Zelensky kind of as a way to kind of weaken Russia, to defeat Russia. And this actually would mean, and any peace deal would mean that they would have to recognize that this was kind of folly, this was a major failure, and this policy was doomed to fail, and they would be held responsible for such a failure. They would bear political costs, and their political parties would do the same. So that's why they continue trying to say that everything is fine and we can just double down, and finally Russia would be defeated, Russia would collapse, economy Russia would suffer kind of suffer without money from oil and so on, which is again this is kind of this is not realistic because this is just a fantasy basically. But they just present this as a reality, and especially European Union leaders like kind of this head of European Commission and also foreign affairs kind of a person in charge of European Union from Estonia, Kaja Kallas. They just kind of in their speeches they talk about something totally different from what can actually, it's possible to see actually, and if a person knows about Ukraine, as I study this conflict, and I know Ukrainian politics very well, and I know this is like speeches which have almost nothing with reality. So this is total fantasy, total um, kind of um, attention that they support all the good, that they are supporting good, but actually their policies are actually detrimental to Ukraine and Ukrainians because they support this war, which is not winnable to Ukraine. That this war is not, this is unwinnable for war for Ukraine. This is unwinnable war for the European Union, unwinnable proxy war for the European Union and other European countries like United Kingdom, and for also for the United States. So unless because this otherwise this would mean a direct war between Russia and the West with the nuclear powers, which is not going to be option for the West. So in this case, they they their policy of prolonging this war is actually is actually very anti-Ukrainian policy because this is a policy which is not again to benefit of Ukrainians. Even so, this is beneficial for Zelensky because again, this enables him to stay in power and to enjoy all this kind of corruption and enjoy this kind of all this great publicity which he still gets from the media and from Western politicians. And this is like for him, this is big reward and a big incentive to continue this war as well.
What makes you hopeful when you look at the past 3 weeks?
I think the Trump plan, as I said in the interview to Portuguese major Portuguese newspaper, when it was revealed, first as leaks in Western media, but then as fully revealed publicly by Ukrainian media and politicians. So I think this plan was concession to reality. So this was for the first time, basically, when there was a concession to reality, which would gave possibility to end the war in Ukraine because of United States policy, because Donald Trump supported such plan. Even so, again, this plan, which was basically reflected options or choices for Ukraine, either to accept bad peace or to again to continue war, claiming this is a good war, but without any kind of possibility of defeating Russia, which means again this war is not a good war. This is actually a terrible war for Ukraine and Ukrainians because this is would be again to fight war which cannot be which would lead to such disastrous consequences to Ukraine and Ukrainians again is not defensible. And I said this at the start of Russian invasion, on the first day of Russian invasion, in my live interview to Ukrainian media, Ukrainian television. I said that the choice is basically is between bad peace and or this good war image, and in this case, again, bad peace is much better than good war. Even again, then when just Russia invaded Ukraine illegally on February 24th, 2022. But again, this is a reality of politicians, reality of conflicts. This is not something which, again, talking about the war and invasions and so on, because many wars, again, were illegal and many wars were resolved, again, either as a part of agreement, peace deal, peace agreement, or they were resolved militarily by military force. And this is like real possibility for Ukraine. There was again real possibility for Ukraine to kind of minimize casualties, minimize negative consequences of the war, and try to kind of achieve a realistic kind of agreement using using Trump plan, which was suggested by Donald Trump, and cover as well, because you would have support from the West, from the United States. But now I became more pessimistic about this. That this would be realized because it was already clear that this is again that this is that Donald Trump is not gonna resort to this policy. He would change their policy, and now again, I'm not kind of optimistic that the war would end as he claims soon by the end of this year. Even this was possible to end this war even earlier if Donald Trump would have used his leverage over Zelensky. And but I think he's not willing to do this to a significant extent, and this is for political reasons. So that's why I think I think in the last few weeks, this became clear as well, and it will, I think, will be also clear later this year. But I think major development, which was very important for me, was also this corruption scandal, which revealed what I suspected. Again, this was not a public knowledge, but I knew, kind of based on my research, that Zelensky is not the one that he presents himself to this media. This image was totally inflated, totally kind of made up image. Again, using media and his talent as an actor, basically. His speeches, which are written not by him, but just he reads all the speeches about heroic and kind of about himself being heroic politician and so on. But actually, the scandal showed that a real image of Zelensky and his close associates linked to corruption, basically stealing money and involved in this kind of such behavior. So that's why I think there would be a real possibility if this scandal would develop and if Zelensky would again be exposed directly via leaks from or via tapes from National Anti-Corruption Bureau, or if his close associates would be arrested or charged with corruption, including his most kind of closest associate. In such case, he would basically might lose power in Ukraine, or he would become so weakened that he would have a little choice, basically, as not to try to have kind of some kind of agreement which might end the war. But again, but this a lot of depends on United States and kind of because, as I mentioned, United States and Western countries have a lot of influence over National Anti-Corruption Bureau. So if they decide to tell National Anti-Corruption Bureau not to release these documents implicating Zelensky and his closest associates, this can be the National Anti-Corruption Bureau would do this. If they would say opposite or would just leave this open for National Anti-Corruption Bureau, in such case, it might be possible that they would act and would expose Zelensky, and this would lead to significant changes in Ukrainian politics because, again, rule of Zelensky was a nightmare for Ukraine and Ukrainians, and this is because of terrible consequences which could have been easily avoided and or prevented this war in the first place. But Zelensky failed on all these counts, and he instead just tried to kind of exploit this war for his own image and try to build dictatorship in Ukraine to kind of monopolize power and took power in Ukraine and enrich himself and his close associates.
To end, and on a more personal note, how do you keep your sanity and clarity in this devastating conflict, given the fact that your analysis is so thorough, so deep?
I think, again, because for me, this is not only academic job, kind of academic research. For me, this is also important as a Ukrainian, because I'm concerned about Ukraine and Ukrainians um, and future of Ukraine. So that's why this is kind of has very important implications. So for me, it's important to know actually what is going on in Ukraine by looking into all this evidence, following all this news, watching all these videos, which are often gruesome videos, people being killed, and so on, and watching the attacks and so on. But I need to analyze this from a perspective of professional. And this is also important to know actually real picture and real outcome of this war and real possibility of what could happen in Ukraine, because this would affect not only kind of Ukraine. This will not only be just academic questions. This is also has effect on me and again and many other Ukrainians. And this is why it's important to know kind of reality and not to just have a visual thinking. And also because I specialize in researching this context for such a long time, I also research even much more significant, much more gruesome conflicts like World War II, Nazi mass murder. I examine Nazi mass murder and also look into Stalinist kind of great terror in Ukraine when many people, much like millions of people were killed kind of and so on during this kind of by Nazis, for instance, in Ukraine, and also kind of involvement of Nazi collaboration formations in Ukraine during this war, during World War II. So I look into conflicts for a very long time. So for me, this is a conflicts. The latest conflict in Ukraine, the current conflict in Ukraine, is just how to say, from a historical perspective, from my research, this is not first war, not first conflict. So this is my main area of research, and this is why kind of I know what you expect from this, from doing this research, and even so, it might have been very difficult to do because it might not be how to say, kind of viewed positively by many people who believe this official propaganda and narratives because they trust the media, they read New York Times, and they believe that they have all this information, and or they just read some kind of Wikipedia and all this what I call garbage in, garbage out sources, in which again this is totally misrepresentation of the conflicts and the war in Ukraine. So for me, this is not something novel. I studied conflicts for a long time, even much more significant conflicts with many more casualties. So in this case, I can say that the current war in Ukraine is not yet is not comparable to World War II, because, for instance, during World War II, there are estimates that about 6 million people in Ukraine were killed or perished during the World War II, and so this is nothing comparable to this war, which is, I think, the largest war in Europe since World War II, and one of the largest wars in the world since World War II. But in terms of casualties, it is not yet, especially civilian casualties, which are now estimated by United Nations documented casualties as about close to 15,000 people, civilians killed. So this is nothing yet comparable to World War II or to many other conflicts which I researched, which I also examined in my research, and about which I teach as well, like for instance, war in Iraq, or again, war in Syria and other conflicts. So that's why war in Yugoslavia. So in this case, I think from a comparative perspective, which is also my area of research, I can say that again, it's possible to actually understand this war and to research this war, and still to be a kind of to have this view, which would be which would be based on kind of long perspective, and compare this war to previous conflicts, and not that this is actually can be much worse here. So that's why kind of that's why I try to research this war in such a way as a scholar, to kind of to have a view which is based on evidence and not based on any kind of narrative promoted by any kind of government, any other source. I need to look into kind of reliable data, and I know that many conflicts which I examine, there are different like propaganda, different narratives promoted by governments, and if we just accept them at face value as a scholars, and many people do this, and even many researchers who do not know this, do not specialize in conflict studies, do not know about conflicts and any other conflict in Ukraine or any elsewhere. They often kind of are not able to compare this war in Ukraine to other conflicts. They are not able to have perspective on this war and possible outcome. They just look into this war as the only kind of a conflict that they know, and they believe that this is actually kind of, or they often also compare this to World War II. Another kind of mistake, because World War II is not comparable to this war for the reasons which I mentioned, but also again for other reasons which I also researched. So that's why I think I can say that I still closely follow the conflict in Ukraine, and I would have a new book which will be published next year, which would also examine independent Ukraine, and which also would include examination of the Russia-Ukraine war and other conflicts in Ukraine since 1991, and entire politics of Ukraine since 1991, when Ukraine became independent. So this is, I think, kind of why I research this and try to do this in such a way. Even so, this is a very difficult subject, and it requires a lot of effort, a lot of time to do this, to look into all the sources, and it is not a kind of subject which is a light subject. This is a very kind of difficult subject to research, because it involves real people whose life are at stake, and future of Ukraine is also at stake. And this is not only limited to Ukraine, but also to many other people in countries which are affected by this war. That's why I think it's important for me as a researcher to do this as a professionally, and also as a Ukrainian to do this, and a Canadian also to do this in a way which would again kind of benefit people, and not just rely on some kind of propaganda or disinformation, and not to represent any view of any government, it's Ukrainian or Russian or Western government or media. I need to look into evidence and base my research on such evidence.
Dr. Ivan Katchanovski, thank you so much for truly being a blessing to myself and really the world, really enlightening us about this devastating conflict.
Yes, thank you.
Ivan Katchanovski. That's why knowledge matters. Make your life a masterpiece. Visit now programs.the-ykm.com. Meant to